The weight of 3 different cell phones vibrating simultaneously in Julian's pockets felt less like a notification and more like a physical assault. He stood in the middle of his daughter's 3rd birthday party, a tray of cupcakes balanced in one hand and a work phone pressed against his ear with the shoulder of his other. He wasn't actually at the party. His body was there, but his soul was being partitioned into tiny, jagged pieces by a dozen different people who all believed they owned a slice of his time. As his daughter reached out for him, her eyes wide with the expectation of a birthday hug, Julian instinctively stepped back to hear a client's complaint about a minor shipping delay. In that moment, the look of confusion on the toddler's face felt like a blade through his chest, yet he didn't hang up. He couldn't. He had spent years training the world to believe that Julian was always, eternally, and unconditionally available. The reputation of being the most reliable man in the city had started as a point of pride. In his youth, Julian viewed his inability to say no as a superpower. He was the friend who helped move furniture at 3 in the morning. He was the employee who answered emails during his own honeymoon. He was the neighbor who fixed every broken fence and the son who managed every family crisis without a second thought. He mistook his lack of boundaries for a surplus of character. He believed that by being everything to everyone, he was making himself indispensable. Instead, he was making himself invisible. By the time he hit his mid-30s, Julian's life had become a chaotic blur of other people's emergencies. His calendar was a mosaic of obligations that had nothing to do with his own dreams or well-being. Because he was always available, people stopped valuing his time. They began to treat his presence not as a gift, but as a utility, like electricity or running water. No one thanks the faucet for turning on, they only complain when the water stops flowing. Julian had become the human equivalent of a public utility, drained by the constant demands of those who had never been taught the meaning of the word limit. The physical toll was the first thing to manifest. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked 10 years older than his birth certificate claimed. Dark circles under his eyes became permanent fixtures, and a constant low-grade tremor lived in his hands. He was existing on a diet of lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of panic. He lived in a state of perpetual almost, always almost finished with the task, always almost ready to relax, always almost present for the people he actually loved. But the almost never transitioned into actual. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday that looked like every other Tuesday. He was sitting in his car in the office parking lot, staring at a dashboard that was lit up with missed calls. He had promised to meet his wife for a rare dinner date, but a coworker had stopped by his desk at the last minute with a quick favor that took 2 hours. Then, his sister had called, weeping about a breakup he had already coached her through 5 times that month. As he sat in the silence of his vehicle, Julian realized he didn't want to go inside his home. He was terrified that if his wife asked him how his day was, he would simply shatter into 1,000 pieces of unexpressed resentment. He looked at his hands and realized they were empty. He had spent his entire adult life filling the hands of others, yet he had nothing to show for it but exhaustion. He had traded his peace for the temporary approval of people who would replace him the moment he truly burned out. He was a martyr for causes he didn't even care about. He was sacrificing his marriage, his health, and his sanity to maintain an image of the nice guy who never let anyone down. In reality, he was letting down the only person who mattered, himself. The transformation didn't happen with a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation. It began with the silence of a phone being turned off. That night, Julian walked into his house, ignored the vibrating devices in his briefcase, and sat down at the dinner table. When his wife looked at him with the weary expectation of another apology, he simply took her hand. He didn't explain the work crisis. He didn't recount his sister's drama. He chose to be unavailable to the world so he could be available to the woman sitting across from him. The following weeks were a brutal exercise in reclaiming his territory. The first time he told a colleague he couldn't help with a project, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. The first time he told a friend he was too tired to grab a late-night drink, he felt a wave of guilt so strong it felt like nausea. But then, something miraculous happened. The world didn't end. The office didn't collapse. His friends didn't abandon him. The ones worth keeping simply adjusted their expectations. He began to realize that no was not a selfish word, it was a protective one. It was the fence that kept his garden from being trampled. As he stopped being available for every triviality, his presence began to carry weight again. When he did show up, he was fully there, eyes bright and mind focused, rather than a hollowed-out shell checking a watch. He learned that being handy made him a tool, but being selective made him a human being. He watched as his daughter's face began to light up when he entered a room, no longer fearing the intrusion of a ringing phone. He felt the tension in his shoulders dissolve into a steady, quiet strength. He had finally understood the bitter irony of his old life. By trying to be everything to everyone, he had been nothing to himself. He stopped measuring his worth by the number of people he helped and started measuring it by the depth of the peace he felt when he was alone. The lesson was etched into the lines of his new life, a quiet truth he wished he had known decades earlier. He had spent his life being a bridge for others to walk on, forgetting that a bridge eventually collapses if it never finds a shore of its own to rest upon. He was no longer the man who answered every call. He was the man who knew which calls were worth answering. When you make yourself available for everything, you eventually become valuable for nothing.